Here are 12 facts about ancient Rome that you probably didn't know. Under the Empire, Roman soldiers were full-time professionals, but they weren't allowed to marry. This is so they could focus on their sole role of taking up arms for the emperor. However, if you look at Roman tombstones or archaeological evidence from the civilian settlements outside of Roman forts, you see that Roman soldiers did have long-term partners and many children. So many people broke this rule. The Emperor Septimius Severus was an army man, and he decided to help out the soldiers. He allowed marriage in the army for the first time. This had a knock-on effect. It made the Roman soldiers more attached to their local areas and less willing to be deployed to the other side of the Roman Empire because they had a wife and children in their fort. They didn't want to move anymore. Every location in the Roman Empire had its own god. Every river, every valley, every hill had its own local deity that was protecting that place. So if you were to make a river crossing, for example, you ought to make an offering to that local god. But there is an issue. You don't know the local god's name, and you don't want to call it by the wrong name because this would greatly offend that deity. So what you'd do is you'd make an offering to the genius loci. This means the local spirit, to placate the god on your passage. Speaking of Roman religion, priests of ancient Rome would often look for signs from the gods, divinations. They could do this in a number of ways. You could look at the organs of a sacrificial animal. You could look at bird flights or the slithering of a particular snake. But they'd do this very particularly, and they'd have to wear a hood while they did it. The reason for this is so that they're not distracted by other gods interfering with their business. Like blinkers on a horse, this keeps them focused on the divination that they need to look at, without any distractions. For most people under the Roman Empire, marriage was quite an informal affair. It was an informal agreement between a husband and a wife. If they said they were married, they were. If they said they weren't married, they were no longer married. A party was expected to celebrate the new union, but this would vary wildly in scale depending on what you could afford. Because divorce was actually quite easy under the Roman Empire, birth rates plummeted, and this really worried the Emperor Augustus because fewer citizens means less tax, so he wanted to do something to increase the birth rate. He made it so that if you were a wife with 3 children, you had the rights of a Roman man. Women had barely any rights in ancient Rome unless you were a wife with 3 children. This encouraged women to have more children, and the Emperor Augustus was very happy because he had more tax. The Roman triumph was an amazing affair. The conquering general would come into the city on a chariot with his army and any booty in tow. The qualification for a Roman triumph was very specific, however. You had to kill at least 5,000 of your enemy. We actually have records of every triumph that took place. From 509 BC, that's the foundation of the Roman Republic, to about 19 BC, midway through Augustus's reign as the first emperor, there were over 300 triumphs. If we do the maths, 300 times 5,000 people dead, that's 1.5 million casualties at least, because the Romans didn't just slaughter 5,000 people to get a triumph, the real number was probably a lot higher. Julius Caesar boasts that he killed at least 1 million Gauls during the conquest of what is now modern day France. A lot of people say that the Romans brought a lot of good to those who they conquered, but they didn't half kill a lot of people along the way. Pubs were actually really common in ancient Rome, although the elite stayed way clear of them and they really didn't like them being a presence. The poet Juvenal said that they were dens for thieves and ne'er-do-wells. And actually the Roman emperors tried to tax and limit what they could sell. They really didn't like this presence that was unfolding in towns and cities across the Roman Empire. But the issue was, many people lived in houses without kitchens, without hearth, or even place for a fire. Lived in some really horrible flats like you can see here. So a lot of plebs had to spend their valuable coins going out to eat every single night in these pubs, probably getting very drunk along the way. One of the things that the Roman Empire is known for is its immense road system. Take a look at this map here of every Roman road that we know of. Now roads are great, they allow your armies to move all over the place to suppress rebels or defend against invading barbarian tribes. They also allow for smooth trade to take place. You could go from Barcelona to Rome on road, which is something that had never been achieved before. But roads are a two-sided coin. Yes, there are good elements, but there are bad elements too. Yes, the Roman armies could move from one place to the other, but invading armies could also use those exact same roads to get to the capital city really, really quickly, which is something they did a few times towards the end of the empire. And all this interconnectivity, well, it spread disease. Some really bad plague spread all over the Roman Empire, like the Antonine Plague, the Plague of Justinian, on these interconnected roads. The ancient Romans had no real understanding of what caused disease, and their interconnected roads did nothing but spread it. Before 55 BC, there was no permanent theatre inside Rome. Nothing like the Colosseum existed. The reason for this is because the Senate feared that any one man who was going to build this permanent theatre would become so immensely popular that he could overthrow the Republic. Before 55 BC, wooden theatres were thrown up for a particular show or gladiatorial games, and then they were taken down afterwards. They weren't permanent. It was actually Pompey Magnus, Pompey the Great, who first built a permanent theatre in Rome. This is where they held the Senate meeting where Julius Caesar was stabbed to death by his close friends and senators. Which is of course a great irony because Pompey Magnus was Julius Caesar's greatest rival, and it is said that he died by a statue of the great man himself. The Vestal virgins were responsible for a number of things. The worship of Vesta firstly, but they also had to keep alight the eternal flame of the city of Rome, and they also kept wills sacrosanct. The Vestal virgins were awarded a position of authority among ancient Romans, and they were the most privileged women in the city. If there were gladiatorial games or a theatre show on, they'd have front row seats, just like a very rich senator might. But this privilege came at immense cost. They had to be chaste. If they were ever found to be unchaste, which often was a rumour spread maliciously against them, then they would be executed. But a Vestal virgin is sacrosanct. You weren't allowed to spill their blood, so their punishment for unchastity was often to be buried alive. We often think that the ancient Romans are quite innovative, but in many ways they lacked a lot of things that we have today. For example, the Romans never invented the wheelbarrow. There is not a single archaeological find, artistic depiction or a literary description of what we call a wheelbarrow today. If they wanted to move things about, they'd simply get some slaves to carry some buckets or to put something on the back of a cart, which would be pulled by a mule or another beast of burden. A lot of people have argued that Rome over-relied on its slave labour, hence why they didn't really need to innovate beyond what the ancient Greeks had already invented a few hundred years before the Roman Empire really took off. Marcus Tullius Cicero was a Roman politician and statesman. He was one of the finest speechwriters of all time, and he was a famous political enemy of Marc Antony. Now Cicero wasn't really known for being a fighter, but he was known for giving excellent speeches. He gave a series of 4 speeches known as the Philippics, and these are probably the finest character assassination in human history. One particular amazing line from this character assassination reads like this: "As Helen was to the Trojans, so has that man been to this republic. The cause of war, the cause of mischief, the cause of ruin." Cicero was a hater, as they'd say today. But unfortunately it didn't pay off for him because Marc Antony eventually did seize enough power to get Cicero murdered. But it didn't just stop there. He ordered that his hands be chopped off along with his tongue and nailed to the Senate door, because of course his tongue and his hands were instruments that he used to dismantle Marc Antony's authority on the Senate floor. Marc Antony eventually did have one up on poor old Marcus Tullius Cicero.